at least the world of Coast, hears this. We're not talking right or left issues. Believe me, if it sounds like I'm beating up on the left, I'll be beating up on the right soon enough, and you'll be right there listening to me do it. And you go, well, I guess he is fair and square, because I am. I think that all politicians are, with rare exception, I think they have the morality of a puff adder. That is really what I think. And keep in mind that the fax machine was invented in the 1800s. The Navy had them in the 50s. We didn't get them until the 80s. All of the technology that you think is current is 30 to 40 years behind what actually exists. So, let's go back to some cowboy wisdom, as depicted by Kevin Costner in the role of Charlie Waits in the movie Open Range, when he said, "People will tell you their bad intentions if you just allow yourselves to hear it." When someone says something like, "We're only 20-some-odd days from fundamentally changing America," well, that sounds really good. We're gonna change it. Wait a minute. Fundamentally changing it? Well, now that might be a bit strong. So let's just keep in mind, these things that we're discussing are not left or right issues. These are human issues. These are American issues. These are earthling issues. And the big question is, if you trust your politicians to safeguard your freedom, your health, your security, you need to ask yourself a question. And I'll tell it to you first in some really bad Latin. Quis custodiet ipsos custodis? Which in English means, who guards the guardians? We shall return with Dr. Tim Ball in just a moment. This is the one and only Coast to Coast AM. John B. in with you for the night, and delighted to be here. Welcome back, Earthlings, and a few ETs, both invited and uninvited. So, Dr. Ball, to just carry on and pick up where we left off. So now, what's become of this group out of East Anglia? After the hacked emails and all of that revealed that they were tweaking the data a little bit.
Yeah, well, just before I get to that, a couple of comments about the things you commented on. One, you mentioned right at the beginning about the airplanes, and you talked about the condensation trail that you saw. One of the things that's changed is that the aircraft with the better, more efficient engines, and of course with fuel conservation, are flying much higher. I discovered this. I had a course where I would take my students to places in Winnipeg where climate and weather data was being used, and I took them to the airport and got them briefed as if they were going to fly over the Rocky Mountains into Vancouver. Suddenly realized that in the wintertime, in both hemispheres, most commercial aircraft are flying in the stratosphere. And, of course, that is going to add the water vapor, and then it's, again, the biggest part of it. It condenses immediately to ice crystals, and, of course, that we're seeing that staying up in those altitudes much longer. A lot of people talk about that as if it's chemtrails, but it isn't. There are also clouds in the stratosphere called noctilucent clouds, and the evidence is that there's been an increase in those, and I suspect it's due to this water vapor going into the lower stratosphere. But besides that, your comment about politics, when Pompeii was buried under the Vesuvian eruption, there was an election that had gone on, and one of the pieces of graffiti reportedly says, "If we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels." So the attitudes haven't changed much over the time, and of course your quoting of "Who guards the guardians" brought that to my mind. But the other point about the politics of it is that a lot of scientists have said to me, "We agree with you, but we are not going to say that publicly," because, and this is one of the measures of how political the climate issue is, and it really underlined it for me, if you say that you don't accept the United Nations view of it, the IPCC view, you're immediately classified as right-wing or conservative. And a lot of scientists have said to me, "No, we're left-wing, we're socialists, and we don't want to be branded as right-wing by agreeing with you publicly on the science." So this is just another measure of what's been going on with this. Now, back to your question about what's been going on at East Anglia. The Climatic Research Unit at East Anglia was set up by Hubert Lamb, who's generally considered to be the father of modern climatology. There was a Reed Bryson at Wisconsin was doing work at about the same time, and they were really the only two schools studying climate in the world at that time. And I had the privilege of working with Dr. Lamb at CRU. He helped me with my doctoral thesis. And, of course, he was the one that said, look, until we've got an adequate database, we can't possibly determine what's going on. And he by the time he retired, he realized that wasn't going to be achieved. And in fact, we've got less climate data now than we had in the 1960s. They've closed weather stations, so we've got less data, not more. And so basically you have to ask yourself, what are they building their computer models on? And the answer is virtually nothing. But the Climatic Research Unit then was taken over by Tom Wigley, and Wigley became the director after Lamb, and And Lamb talks about this in his autobiography. He said Wigley took it in a completely different direction, and Wigley was the one starting to work with the computer models and starting to say, oh, well, humans are having an impact on climate. And, of course, Wigley was very central, working in the IPCC, setting that up. He attended the meetings in 1985 in Villach, Austria, as did the fellow who was director of the CRU when the emails were leaked out, Phil Jones. And the people at the CRU, and Benjamin Sanders, another, he's not there now, but he was a graduate student of Tom Wigley's. He's now at Lawrence Livermore. These people then became pivotal in the IPCC. And the way that they did it was that there were critical chapters in the reports. One is the data, and Jones was basically in charge of that. The second one was the reconstruction of past climates, and Michael Mann was in charge of that. And then there was the computer models, of course, and Andrew Weaver's been major in that with the 1995 report, the 2001-2007 report. Well, what's interesting is that these people that were either at CRU or very closely associated with them are the same people that are on the IPCC. So they effectively controlled the reports of the IPCC. Now, just to give you another idea, we talked earlier about the terms of reference for the IPCC. First of all, the definition of climate change, and then the way that they set it up, and this is Maurice Strong with his bureaucratic skills again, was they had the Working Group 1, which was the science report, and that comprises about 600 people, or it's less than that, but about 600. But very few of those were actual climate scientists. And John McLean in Australia has done a very good detailed analysis of that. They then produce a report, and of course it starts with that very limited look at only human causes of climate change. And their findings then go to Working Group 2 and 3. They accept what they say, which, CO2 is going to go up, therefore temperature is going to go up. They accept that, and then they look at, what impact will this have? And they come up with if the CO2 goes up, the temperature goes up, and this will happen, and that'll happen. And that's where all the scary stories that are in the media all the time are coming from. And then the third group look at, what do we do about this? You can introduce carbon taxes, and you can transfer wealth and do all of these other things. So the whole thing was orchestrated. So in other words, probably, I would say maybe 14 or 50 of them that actually knew much about climate. Yet we heard, it's a consensus. There's 2,500 people in the IPCC, and therefore that's the consensus. Well, of course, science isn't about consensus, but this is all deliberately set up. Now, just to control it even further, and this is the most bizarre thing you can imagine, they set up what's called the summary for policymakers. So after the science report people have done their report, then a group, the Summary for Policymaker group, which is mostly bureaucrats from these national weather agencies around the world, and a few politicians thrown in, they get to write a summary. All right? And the summary is released 7 months before, or at least 7 months before, the science report is released.
Right.
And, of course, when you start comparing the documents, they're totally different. The science report is saying, oh, yeah, well, this is certain and that's certain, and, this probability, that. You go and read the science report, it doesn't say that at all. The science report then goes, or the summary report goes back to the science report people and say, look, make sure that there's no great disagreement with what we've written in the summary. So it's like an executive writing a summary of his company and then asking the employees to find the data to support the summary he's already written.
Oh,
that's what they're doing, and it's incredible.
Well, so as you have observed, certainly you've tracked this. I mean, you can practically graph it out.
Yeah.
Well, what's the next step? I mean, or do you already see end game from here?
Well, the public, for the most part, you look at the polls on it. And by the way, just to finish your question about the leaked emails, when Morris Strong set it up, the IPCC was set up to bring forward the scientific information that they wanted. Say, oh yeah, it's CO2, and we're 90% certain that for the last 50 years the temperature increase has been due to human CO2. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. They virtually ignore the sun. But the political agenda was done through the 1992 Rio Declaration that we talked about at the beginning. So now he's got the science part done by the IPCC. He's got the political agenda to put it in place through Rio, and then that's where the Kyoto idea came from. And of course, it's all part of that Agenda 21. So now he's got the public and political agenda in place. And of course, they were having these COPs. That's a Conference of the Parties, which was pushing the political agenda for Kyoto, which was actually a transfer of wealth from those nations that were producing too much CO2, which was destroying the planet, and for their sins, they had to pay money to the developing nations that were suffering from the climate change that these nasty people had created. So it was a straight transfer of wealth. Now, interestingly enough, the U.S. Senate didn't see through that in a sense, but what they did was they say, no, look, for the science is too weak and the cost of the economy is too great. So the U.S. Senate voted 95-0 against it. And so the politicians saw through it. And, of course, that's what's going on now. Environment and climate are falling off the public's agenda and the politicians' agenda, which goes back to the GOP comments you asked me about earlier. But nonetheless, the whole agenda was moving forward through these Conference of the Parties. And one of the critical ones was scheduled for Copenhagen. And at that one, they were going to recover and prepare to replace the Kyoto, which was failing. And there's a whole lot of stories about the Kyoto, which we can talk about. But Copenhagen was seen as a critical conference. And they said that. They didn't hide it. They said, oh, Copenhagen's critical. Well, I think that what happened was that somebody, and I think it was an inside job from the CRU, somebody in there got a conscience and said, look, I know what these guys are doing. I know how they're cooking the books. I know how they're controlling publications and getting editors fired who dare to publish articles they don't agree with. And so a few weeks before Copenhagen, these emails, and it was only 1,000 initially, were leaked. And it was interesting because in that first 1,000, yes, there was some of the stuff about the climate science, but you really had to know climate to understand those. But there were enough of them that showed things that the public would instantly recognize as criminal or incorrect or, unacceptable behavior. And so that was what caught the public's attention with that first 1,000. And, of course, it had the desired effect on Copenhagen, and the Copenhagen conference essentially fizzled. Now, they then tried to reconstitute it in Durban and South Africa, and so again, in anticipation of that, another 5,000 emails were leaked. But these, unless you understand the climate and the science of it, to know what they were doing, those emails, for the most part, seem innocuous. So they were able to say, oh, no, nothing here. This is just ordinary banter between scientists. You know, they're not. You know, you're predetermining who's going to be authors on papers. You're predetermining who's going to do the peer review of these papers. And Professor Wegman, by the way, identified that problem when he did the Wegman report for the Barton Committee. So whoever did the leaking had to know not only the codes to get into the University of East Anglia's computer, and then had to know the codes to get into the CRU, the Climatic Research computers, and had to know which emails of the it's an estimated 200,000 that they're still out there, which ones to pick out. So it was somebody that really knew. So it wasn't just a matter of a hacker, because any hacker could have got in and just dumped these emails out there. But these were carefully selected. It was somebody who really knew what they were doing. And of course, what's interesting is a couple of things that happened. The minute the emails were released, Phil Jones called the police and said, we've been burgled, we've been hacked. And of course, that was important because in England, if information is obtained by hacking, it cannot be used in a court. If it's obtained from a whistleblower, because that's what I think this was, then it can be used in court. So there's a whole lot of ramifications. And of course, the police were called in. But what else did they do? They called in the PR people. They started a PR campaign. Oh, nothing here. No, these are just perfectly ordinary banter between scientists. But it's devastating if you know the climate science and what they were actually up to. And when I said they got an editor fired, they really did. It was Mr. Sayers at the Geophysical Research Letters. And so that's what was going on with all of those emails. But in the meantime, of course, the economy is going south, and therefore the public are less concerned about it. A couple of other things that happened, John, are the cold winters that we had. Notice this winter they're starting to say, oh, it's the warmest ever, and you know they're fiddling the climate data. In fact, there's a lawsuit going on in New Zealand now against the New Zealand agency that handles the climate data, showing how they lowered the historic record to make the slope of the curve, in other words, to make it look like there was a greater warming over the last 100 years than there actually was. And so the cold winters, I say the cold weather made people start to question. And of course, then they were forced into silliness. You heard these things like, oh, well, the cold weather is due to the global warming. Well, even people who don't understand science say, hang on a minute. And then we had Al Gore, when he got up before the U.S. Senate and said, the debate is over, the science is settled. Well, a lot of media people started to say, hang on a minute, science is never settled. You can't.
Well, that's why they call it science. It's an ongoing
It's ongoing, exactly. So there were a whole series of things. My worry right now, and you asked me about where this is going in the future, there's a couple of concerns that I have. One is that we've got to get science out of the bureaucracies. Government should not be doing the science, because immediately it's almost guaranteed to be political, because you're going to produce the science that your political masters want. And
hold on one second.
A healthy thing.
Dr. Ball, hold on one second, because I want to get all of this. We're going to pick up right where we left off here. Do not let the government control the science. What a good idea. Dr. Tim Ball and you and I will continue this most singular discourse when we come back. This is Coast to Coast AM. Just stay right there. Thank you very much, my invisible friend. Well, maybe the next climate summit should be held in Bangkok so the tough guys can tumble and the hard men will become humble. It's very interesting how it's all linked together, isn't it? Which, going back to that, who guards the guardians? I wonder. I know. The bankers. Yes? No? What do you think? You can shoot me an email if you want to. Just tell me your opinion. It's very good. If it's clever, I'll get it on the air. And we'll get a reaction from our guest tonight, Dr. Tim Ball, a rational man, learned man, And clearly a teacher, because even when I can't remember where we left off, he does. And I like that. All right, we'll be back in just a minute. This is Coast. 2 minutes, please. All right, Dr. Ball, you were saying don't let the government get involved in science. That's a good idea.
Yes, well, as I said, when the bureaucrats take over, and it's particularly true in terms of things that are scientific, because as I said, those bureaucrats can then challenge the politicians, say, how dare you question me? I'm the scientist. What do you know about it? So it gives them an ascendancy. But it's one of the things that's interesting, and it probably applies in the U.S., and I certainly know it applies in England and Canada. If you were to write a check for your different levels of government, and in Canada that would be the federal, provincial, equivalent to your states, then municipal, which would be like your city level. It's about 34% for federal for us, 18% provincial, about 9% for city. But ask yourself, who gives you the most services? Who provides for you on a daily basis? And of course, one of the things that's been happening, and the founding fathers were aware of this, and the way they wrote it, is that the real role, really the only role of federal government, is to defend the nation. And so that if they just get growing and growing and growing, and this happens. It's the nature of systems. You know, you have an idea, and your Constitution was an idea, or the idea of a company, but ideas, in order to disseminate them and make them function, need a system, but systems are inherently rigid, and of course, eventually what happens is the system becomes more important than the idea. And you can see that going on in the U.S. now with the, particularly say the EPA, which is what I've been watching. And it parallels, of course, the same thing that Martin Luther was looking at, where he said, you've forgotten about Christianity. The church has become more important than Christianity. And I wrote an article likening the carbon tax and carbon credits to the indulgences that the church were asking for in the Middle Ages. And so the tax structure is one of the things you've got to look at. And of course, you've got the battle going on in the U.S. now of the states demanding, the powers that they've got. We've got the same issue here in Canada. The provincial jurisdictions are being usurped by the federal government, and so that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I see is that if you and maybe we should go back on this a little bit, John, but I was several years ago I was accused of saying, you're giving comfort to the polluters. And I must say that bothered me for a bit. And then I started to think about it more, and then I thought, no, if you tell the people something falsely, and then they find out that they've been lied to, there was the old cry wolf thing, then that gives even more comfort to the polluters, because they can turn around and say, these people scared you to death with all of these, sky is falling and pollution this and all of that. And it turns out it's not true, and you lose the momentum on the issues you do need to deal with. And one of the things I'm afraid of is, and give you an example, with the environmental issue. Environment was a new paradigm, a new way of thinking came in. It was essential. We need to keep our house clean. We need to look after things well and husband our resources and all these other things. But what happened was that the Club of Rome took it over for a political agenda, and then the extreme environmentalists grabbed it. And they go around saying, we're the only ones who care about the planet, the children, and the future. And, of course, they can get funding from the government, and the people that are challenging them don't get funding from the government. And so what ends up with is that the majority of people are put into feeling guilty. The truth is, all of us care about the environment, but how dare these people take the moral high ground on us? And, of course, I use the word moral deliberately because the environment has essentially become a religion. And my concern is that as the public find out that all of these predictions about global warming and about this and that and the other turn out not to be true, then the issues that we do need to deal with won't get dealt with. And that's my problem. And the other part of it, by doing the climate science through the bureaucracies. You can go and look at Joanne Nova's website, where she documents the $70 billion of federal money that's gone into climate change research in the U.S. And what did it do? It didn't do anything. It hasn't improved anything. Weather forecasts are no better. And of course, if you can't forecast the weather for 10 days, you certainly can't forecast the climate for 100 years.
No.
And in Canada, Canadian government in 5 years spent $6.8 billion, and for Canada, out of our budget, that's huge, on climate change. Meanwhile, they didn't even meet their own targets on cleaning up air pollution.
Well, who got the money, Doctor?
Well, of course, that's the problem. The money went to the researchers, the scientists that were proving the original hypothesis. Now, let me elaborate on that. See, what's gone on here, John, is they completely thwarted the scientific method. Science works by creating a hypothesis. They say, well, if this can happen. So they said, if CO2 increases, the temperature will go up, and CO2 will increase because of human activity and fossil industries and so on, and therefore we're going to have a runaway global temperature. Well, as Richard Lindzen said over 20 years ago, the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And anybody that dared to be a climate skeptic and say, hang on a minute, I got a problem with that hypothesis, which is the way science is supposed to work. You try to disprove the hypothesis. They got silenced, as I said earlier, by being marginalized, paid by the oil companies. But even more frightening, because the governments were involved through their weather agencies, the funding only went to those scientists that were proving the hypothesis, not disproving the hypothesis. And so this is why they were able to come out, or even though it was wrong, they were able to come out. Naomi Oreskes wrote an article saying, oh, well, I've Googled and I found 900, and Gore talks about this in his movie, I find 900 and some articles, and not one single one that questions the theory that CO2 and humans are causing it. Well, first of all, it was because of the keywords that she used in her Google search that determined what results she got. There's actually thousands of articles being published, despite what we're being told. But also because, as I say, the funding was only going to one side of the issue. And of course, the funding in universities has become a frightening distorter of what's going on. I've watched this. I talked to American college people in England. They cut back in the 70s and 80s as the funding became a problem. They cut funding to universities. The universities discovered that, look, we can take a percentage off the top of any research funding a faculty member is getting for a perfectly reasonable argument. They said, well, we're providing heat and light and space, so you should pay for that. So we'll take 35% off your research funding. Well, of course, the faculty member simply added that into the amount of funding they requested from the government.
Sure.
Okay, but what it meant was that a faculty member became more valuable to the university based upon the amount of money they were bringing in. And of course, that is completely distorted. And it went from, during my career, it went from publish or perish to publish or bring funding in or perish. And it's completely distorted. It's happening in medicine, drug research, the same thing, the funding distorting everything. And but the climate science, it not only is distorted it, but it was part of the deliberate strategy of putting the funding through those government agencies.
A fellow named Neil Howe, who's been on the show, wrote a book called Millennium. The Millenniums, talking about really the people who were born in the early to mid-'80s and how they will perhaps restore some ethics. But this is extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, we have been dancing around. I mean, this is a very good nuts and bolts discussion about the mechanics of this fraud.
Yep.
That's my opinion. I should probably take a moment to point out that my opinions do not necessarily represent the views of Premier Radio Networks or the affiliate station that you're listening to this through. But you know what? This is just downright dangerous because it's obvious we can't just continue to burn gasoline indefinitely. But it's also obvious that that those in power absolutely intend for us to continue to burn gasoline, just pay a lot more for it. Witness this gigantic oil reserve up in the Dakotas. Supposed to be more oil up there, sweet crude oil, than in the entire Middle East. Not going to touch it. This Keystone Pipeline, not going to touch it. But is anybody making any moves toward a genuine alternative fuel to this? I don't see it.
No, well, of course, this is the problem. You see, and you see it going on not only in the U.S. with Obama, but alternate energies. What's interesting is that if alternate energies and green economies were brand new ideas, I'd say fine. Let's give it a try. Let's try, as you said, find an alternate. But wherever it's been tried, it's failed. When you look at the situation of Spain, where for every green job they created, it cost 2 other jobs. And it's been a complete failure. Most countries in the world are stopping their subsidies to wind power, and also a lot of the subsidies to solar power are being stopped around the world because they've tried these things and they don't work. But the alternate energies, of course, are pushed because you convinced yourself and have been trying to convince people that CO2 is a pollutant and is causing this climate change. And it isn't. And so the whole thrust to alternate energies is based upon a completely false assumption of false science. And the problem with alternate energies it is, well, first of all, hydrogen was proposed, but where do you get the hydrogen from? You get it from fresh water. Well, fresh water is a problem in many parts of the world. And then how much energy does it take to extract the hydrogen from the water? And then the volatility of the hydrogen. And I remember years ago, Mercedes built a hydrogen-fueled car, and they said it took them 2 hours to fill the gas tank on the thing because of the volatility. Then you've got the problem with wind and solar. What do you do when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? If you really wanted to pursue a solution to electricity, you would put everything into finding efficient, cheap ways of storing the electricity on large scales. Now we can do batteries, and you see the issue with the batteries and the hybrid cars and so on. I mean, most of the cost of those cars is in the battery system, and they have a limited lifespan. And as the studies show, the Prius is more damaging in its total production to the environment than any other cars. But you see, they distort the whole thing because they don't do the proper cost-benefit analysis, and they promote it on the grounds, oh, we're saving the planet and we're saving everything, and it's all, none of it makes any sense whatsoever. The reality is that we've got enough oil, as you said, and with the process that we got. And by the way, I was in Pierre, South Dakota, and giving a talk to agricultural bankers about a month after 9/11. And they said, well, what's the Canadian view? And I said, well, I can't give you the Canadian view. I can give you one Canadian's view. And they said, what's that? I said, just tell Saudi Arabia that you got 5 more years. At the end of 5 years, we won't be buying any more oil from you. I got to tell you that 19 of those hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would have solved the terrorist problem in a flash because the money is more important to them than the terrorism. Okay? And then the bankers said to me, well, what's the alternative? I said, the Athabasca tar sands. They'd never heard of it. Well, in the Alberta side, there's at least 1 trillion barrels of oil.
Was that all?
Right. And there's as much in the Saskatchewan side that they haven't even started to touch yet. There's the same amount again in Saskatchewan as there is in Alberta, and yet that isn't in the news at all. So now, okay, you're right. We can gradually wean ourselves off the oil if you want to do that, but let's look at some more sensible things. I think that one of the reasons that General Motors were pushed into producing the Volt, which has turned out to be a disaster, General Motors were on track to build cars running on natural gas. The adaptation to it is easy. There are a lot of cars running on propane now. Natural gas is far less polluting in CO2 and everything else, and there's far more of it. And, when you imagine you've got your house heated by natural gas, you can fill up your car in your own garage. And natural gas to run our vehicles. And then you have atomic energy for your electricity for your homes, and you can also supplement that with some of the alternate energies on different times. And coal. You can burn coal absolutely clean. There's a consortium of 3 companies with their own money built a completely clean burning coal plant in North Dakota, and Mr. Murray was involved in it, and it got no help from the government, gets no recognition from the government whatsoever. And so you can burn coal perfectly clean. And then, of course, the oil industry would remain as the petrochemical industry for plastics and fertilizers and all these other things. But none of these things are being pursued in a sensible, rational way because of the politics of the issue, the politics of climate and the politics of alternate energies. And until we stop this nonsense, it isn't going to get any better.
You know, it occurs to me, and this is probably pretty rash, but it really looks like this discussion of that's been going, it's been ongoing, although certainly the mainstream media doesn't cover it. But it's a combination of communism and capitalism. Oh, the money will definitely be the lubricant, but this is clearly about global governance. This is clearly a cap. They're using the money as the lubricant for the machine that will enslave humanity. And I've just there it is. I've just said it. And
well, John, let me elaborate on that idea, because for a long time I was working with the Canadian Wheat Board, which is they sell the wheat for the Canadian farmers. It's paid for by a fee off of the farmers. Each bushel they pay so much to the Wheat Board, and what they do is they monitor climate around the world, see where the harvest is failing, and then they send their salespeople out to sell Canadian wheat. And one of the things that I learned then was that they knew when China was going to buy wheat from Canada, because suddenly a whole lot of jade and precious objects appeared in the Hong Kong market because the Chinese paid cash for Canadian wheat.
All right, stand by, Doc. We've got to come back to you because we're coming up on a hard break. I want you to pick up right where you left off, and let's go ahead and just hammer this thing in our final hour as we continue with Dr. Tim Ball on Coast to Coast AM. Stay please. Some of these programs are pretty controversial. You know, as we go along talking tonight with Dr. Tim Ball, I'm thinking as the government encroaches upon us more and more, privacy is less and less, we're being squeezed more and more by expense and taxes, we'll complain, and then eventually we'll resist. But the question, why the need for all this surveillance? In our homes, on our phones, drones in the sky, talk shows. This one being monitored to hear what we may be saying, resistant to the global takeover. And we're talking about climate change tonight, but there are scientists among you out there. There are intelligent leaders waiting to lead out there, waiting for your voice to be heard. We are. All of us, waiting for your voice. What does Spock said to his duplicate? Every revolution begins with one voice. Why not yours? What will happen when we resist? The food, the fuel, everything increasing in expense. What will happen when we resist? We'll be back for our final hour with Dr. Tim Ball, a rational man, climatologist, and a solid thinker. Stand by. 2 minutes. Coast to Coast AM will return. John B. Weldon with you tonight, talking with Dr. Tim Ball. You know, Doctor, I want you to carry on with what you were saying about all these artifacts that began showing up when it was time for China to do some buying. But, you know, as I sit here, I'll tell you the truth, I was trying to just thank everybody for becoming a Coast Insider, and I could barely get it out because it's one thing to talk about this stuff, but when I really start into this and it becomes a rich conversation rather than an interview, I start getting mad and a little bit upset and slightly inarticulate because this whole thing is just making me nuts because it's right out there in front of everybody what's going on, and yet the ship just keeps sailing in the same direction. So comment on that as you will and just carry on with where you were because you're very interesting and I want to hear everything you have to say.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and of course that, as I said, that's what they rely on, is the ship will keep going on in the same direction. I mean, one of the interesting, and I'll get back to the wheat thing in China in just a second, but one of the interesting statistics is that the only German prisoner of war that ever escaped was a guy got out of a logging camp in Canada and got down to South America. No German prisoner ever escaped in Britain, but hundreds of them escaped in Germany. And I think the difference was that a lot of the German people were opposed to Hitler and what he was doing. And whereas in England, the whole country was behind what was going on. And I think that's a very telling sort of thing. But the point I was making about with China was that they knew, as I said, the Canadian Wheat Board knew when China were going to buy some wheat from Canada because these precious objects showed up, and they paid cash for their wheat. And they told me that what was going on was China was buying wheat from Canada around $2 to $3 a bushel at that time, but they were then making their own people eat the wheat and taking their rice and selling the rice that they were growing into Southeast Asia and other markets for $3 and $4 a bushel. In other words, they were turning a profit on the deal. And so what you have going on in China is really what I call state capitalism. And of course, as you know, anybody that tries to do business, even in Russia today, ultimately the state will step in when they don't like what's going on and control what's happening. And of course, China's exactly the same way. And of course, by the way, I've worked with both Russian and Chinese climatologists over reconstruction of past weather, and they have a very different view of the world than North America or even Western Europe. And it's something I think that we make a big mistake. We say, well, we're dealing with the Chinese, not realizing the Chinese see the world completely differently. Basically, they see everything on the planet is there for the betterment and advancement of humans. And if you don't believe me, just go to a Chinese food market and everything that crawls, wriggles, is for sale to eat. End of story. And of course you see them building 2 coal burning plants a week right now, and nuclear plants they're putting up all over the place. So what's the point of unilateral, even if CO2 was a problem, but when it isn't. So, this idea about state capitalism, of course, then you can expand to the world in terms of the world government. And one of the things that they were discussing at Copenhagen that I mentioned earlier, the Conference of the Parties at Copenhagen, which was sidelined by the leaked emails, but the discussion there was about setting the taxation of carbon through the International Monetary Fund, and it was all going to be this centralized banking idea, which of course is how you establish a world government. It's the way they did it with the unifying of the money in Europe, with the euro coming into being. So it's and as I said, how do you compete with state capitalism? I'm not sure.
State capitalism, that's the perfect combination of communism and capitalism, isn't it? That's what it is.
Yeah, exactly. We and of course, governments basically run Ponzi schemes, except that they can as the American governments and the British government are doing, you can keep the Ponzi scheme going because you can just print more money. With a Ponzi scheme run by somebody in Wall Street, they run into problems the minute somebody says, "Hey, I want my money back." Now they've got a problem. But if we went to the government and say, "Hey, we want our money back," they just print more money and give it to you, and of course they can perpetuate the Ponzi scheme. And but state capitalism, state running of everything, and it's really the debate of the post-war debate. I've written about this in an article on my website. But during the war, we surrendered most of our rights, individual rights, to the government in the war effort. Certainly, I was born in England and living in England at the time. I mean, you even had your clothing rationed. The government decided how many coats you could buy and everything else. And, in fact, a lot of that rationing went on up to the 1950s. But what happened after the war was that government were loath to give back all of that power that they had. And, of course, then since then, the government's grown and grown. And what we're at the point now is we're starting to say, well, maybe government's not the best running everything, but we've got generations who've never known anything different.
Well, and it's amazing, too. Can anybody point out a poor politician? Anybody who's been in office for very long? Are any of these people at, $30,000, $40,000 a year? I don't think so.
Well, of course, John, one of the things, and I worked with a Canadian author on a book on the Hudson Bay Company, which, of course, is the most successful multinational corporation in history. But he said to me one day, there's only two kinds of politicians. There are those that say, I've got some ideas that I think could help the country, and then there are those that say, I've got some ideas that I think could help myself. And he said, they're both always there. All that changes is the percentage of them. But now in today's society, where it's the narcissistic society, you've got a preponderance of those that are there to help themselves, and any of those that dare to say, hey, maybe we should do this for the country, are seen by the rest of them as fools and get silenced very quickly. And
the father of advertising, I saw this about 5 o'clock in the morning one time, and it was about the father of advertising. I don't want to say which advertising agency it was, but it was one of the initials in a four-initialed agency. And he said something to the effect of, if you want that new house, buy it. If you want a new car, buy it. If your wife wants a mink stole, get it for her. Get yourself so hopelessly in debt that you can't believe it, because you will realize levels of productivity in yourself that you never dreamed were even possible. And look where it's brought us. Yeah. That's the whole mentality.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the advertising agents, the advertising industry, bless them, each and every one. They've hired me to do a lot of jobs before, so I'm probably shooting myself in both feet in another unmentionable part as well by saying something like this. But we used to make jokes when I would do some of these little liners for radio stations, contributing to the decline of Western civilization. Here we are, rock whatever. Well, the thing about it is that we were joking, we thought, but we actually were contributing to the decline of Western civilization. And advertising, in general, while it's a beautiful thing, it has convinced everybody that they need to one-up the next guy, hence the expression keeping up with the Joneses. And now it's snowballed into this huge thing where nobody is real. I mean, the guy's handing you the keys to your new car and says, come back next year, because wait till you see what I got for you next year. That's going to make this new car you just bought, that you just dropped $20,000 the moment that it rolls out of the parking lot, it's going to make it look like a Model T compared to what we got coming. But thanks very much for your business. I mean, what kind of mentality is this?
Yeah, well, and of course, a couple of points about that. The other, by the way, is the PR, public relations. I mean, one of the things that is interesting about this whole climate issue is that the people at East Anglia, they got the police in first, but they also hired a PR guy to deal with the issue for them. And the guy that they hired had been involved in the hacking of cell phones for stories for the News of the World.
No, is that all?
Oh, yeah. And of course, I see the pattern of PR in the pushback because they now realize they're losing the climate change battle, and I see the pattern of PR. I mean, the phrases that are common to all of these people that are doing it, such as "the debate is over." Well, of course, that's the same thing as saying the science is settled. And they even talk about in one of the leaked emails, because the way that they controlled things was they controlled the peer review process, and then they put down other people and say, well, how many peer-reviewed papers has he got? Oh, he hasn't got very many. But they could do that because they knew it was they were controlling it. But even in one of the leaked emails, they said, we better be careful. This peer review thing might come back and bite us. And, of course, it is, and as it should. But the PR spin on everything now, even the science, and one of the things that, now it is about information, John, because one of the things that's been going on is, and I noticed it, whether it's Fox News or any of them, they don't have the weather anymore. They have extreme weather.
Right.
Everything's hyperbole everywhere, and they say, well, there's a hurricane. No, hurricane's normal. If you live in a hurricane zone, you're going to have hurricanes. Hello, but everything's extreme, and people say, well, the weather's more severe than ever. No, it isn't. It's just that you're hearing about it more. It's just like in the old, if you're introduced to somebody or you hear about somebody, and it seems like every time you turn around, there they are. They were always there. They were just not part of your world. And so now climate and all these stories, and part of the PR campaign that's going on is there's a steady stream of articles coming out saying, oh, well, it was the warmest year ever, and there's more storms, there's more this. But when you start to break them down, and I just did one recently on my website, an article that came out, and I just said, okay, here's how you break it down. Here's what they're actually saying. You interpret it for people, and then they realize that there's really nothing to the story except that it's being used to push a political or a particular agenda. And of course, that's part of the difficulty. I mean, the Internet is great. It democratizes information, but you've got to know how to read it. You've got to be able to read it with discrimination. You've got to know what they're actually saying. And so that's the real challenge. And, of course, it's made even more difficult when these masters of the spin are involving themselves in science and other areas that really should be outside of politics altogether.
Do you think that this initiative that's been undertaken, do you think it's this global warming thing, do you agree that it's losing steam, or do you think that it'll just be ratcheted up a notch? And I mean, you've done modeling and trend tracking on all kinds of things, it appears.
Yeah.
Is there a logical next step in the evolution of this global governance process, or has this particular leg run its course, and now they're going to shift into some other technique?
Well, of course, what's going on now is that, as I said, the public generally. Obviously, there are still a percentage that have trouble with it and buy into it. And and they'll throw things at you like well, what about sea level rise and all of this stuff, and what about the Arctic ice melting and the polar bears? And when you explain what's actually going on there, the fact that every single summer an area the size of the continental U.S. melts every single summer, an area half the size of the state of Illinois melts every single day, and that's normal, then they start to see how they're being duped. And the public don't necessarily fully understand something, but they understand when there's a snow job going on. Maybe an inappropriate phrase, but they sense that. What's keeping it going right now are those scientists who, of course, have made a career out of it, the environmentalists who, of course, are losing it as an opportunity. But as I said earlier in the program, they're shifting towards water as the great next threat. And, of course, water with the moral component of that will be huge. And we should maybe do a whole program on water one night. But the other thing is that the politicians are still hanging on to it because they don't understand the science, but they also see the tax potential. And the potential, because the only thing that politicians do with 100% efficiency is find new ways to tax you. It's like with corporations, the service can get worse and worse, but the billing's always right on time. So I always tell them, right, put the people working in the billing department over in the service department and get things going again. But I think that once the politicians realize that the public are simply not buying this anymore. I know it's going on in Canada. The government's cut a lot of the funding to Environment Canada and shifting the focus. And so I think it's losing its momentum. But as I said, what you've got to be prepared for is that push for more and more government, it will still be there, but they'll find another vehicle, and I happen to think it's water.
Water. Well, it's already more expensive than gasoline.
Well, yes. Yeah, and in fact, there was a documentary made several years ago about water more precious than oil, and there was a conference in Milwaukee in the 1990s where Oppenheimer, the investment company, had a meeting for people with $1 billion or more to invest. I knew about it because a former student of mine was handling a $2 billion portfolio, and he was invited. And he said, who was sitting at the table but Coca-Cola and buying up water rights around, and later on they brought out their Dasani brand of water and bottled water and so on. And of course, there's been several conferences in New York and Boston on water. And if you had a portfolio of stocks just related to water, either purification or delivery or whatever, you'd have done extremely well. In fact, I understand you'd have done better than any other set of portfolios you could have had. But,
yeah, I sure wish I'd bought Microsoft back in the 80s, don't you? We will continue our discussion for the final half hour with Dr. Tim Ball. I like him. And according to my email box here, which is blowing up, a lot of you like him too. So shoot an email to johnb@coasttocoastam.com and I'll get it to the good doctor. We will continue. This is Coast. Thanks, Ross. I really would like to stay here all night, but let me leave you with a little quote here before we take our final little 2-minute break and enter our last segment with Dr. Tim Ball. When you see that trading is done, not by consent, but by compulsion, when you see that in order to produce, you need to obtain permission from men who produce nothing. When you see that money is flowing to those who deal not in goods, but in favors. When you see that men get richer by graft and by pull than by work, and your laws don't protect you against them, but protect them against you. When you see corruption being rewarded, and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed. Ayn Rand, 1905, 1982. Source, Atlas Shrugged. Well, we're not shrugging, are we? We're chugging. All the way to the end, bitter or sweet. It's up to us, isn't it? We'll be back with the last little segment with Dr. Tim Ball. 2 minutes, please. This is Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Tim Ball, it is an absolute delight to have you with us tonight and be able to talk with you for most of 3 hours about stuff that people are just not going to hear unless they are looking specifically for it. So thank you very much. And pick up where you left off.
Okay.
I can't remember where we were at this moment, but because we've covered so much.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about government and government control, and
yes.
You'd read the quote from Ayn Rand, which, of course, it shows that people are aware of these things. I think that there's we'd also talked about water resources, and I was going to mention that the NAFTA, which, of course, a lot of people have talked about and criticized, and Ross Perot saying, about jobs leaving the U.S., and he was so right on that. But it was about water resources because we already have 80% free trade between Canada and the U.S., and so what was left to trade, and the negotiators on both sides were both experts in water resources, so that was what it was all about. And of course, the way it will be done is that water becomes a commodity that is like gasoline as a unit price, and then once it's a commodity, it has to be part of the free trade agreement, and then also it will be it won't be shipped by tankers or anything like that, or diversion of rivers. It'll be done through pipelines, and pipelines, and maybe Obama should learn this, is part of the free trade agreement in the bulk carrier section. And I had done some research for a company that was looking at building water pipelines from Canada to the U.S., and of course Canada's got about 30% of the world's fresh water. But beyond all of that, I think that and by the way, what's important about that, John, is we've talked about climate change and global warming, and all the focus is on the temperature, and all the focus on the warming. But the reality is, and when you say to people, what's wrong with warming? For a lot of the world, warming is a good thing, and they're trying to make light of that now. But for Canada, for example, a 1 or 2 degree warming means our reduction of energy use and so on and so forth. and an increase of our frost-free season for food production and so on. The only thing that people can ultimately come up with is, oh, well, the ice is going to melt and the sea level is going to rise, which is why Al Gore made it such a big part of his Inconvenient Truth movie, which, by the way, again, you see, you've got to concede, was a superb piece of propaganda, but that's what it was. And I don't know if many of your listeners know this, but a UK court, a week before he got the Nobel Prize for that movie, ruled that it was political propaganda and had 9 major scientific errors. And they said if the government, they were going to show it in the schools of England, it had to be with the warning about the errors and the political propaganda. But anyway, that's another story. But the focus only on warming. But now we're in a situation where the world is starting to cool down. And it's been cooling slowly but with increasing speed since 2000. And cooling periods are a much greater threat, but the world's preparing for warming. And it's completely illogical. But what's even more illogical is we know virtually nothing about precipitation. I mean, they don't even have enough weather stations to meet the statistical requirements for measurements of rainfall in Africa, the whole continent, that they can't even build computer models because they don't have the data. And yet, what do we hear from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Oh, well, there's going to be more droughts. Well, that's counterintuitive. If you get a warmer world, there's more evaporation, more moisture in the atmosphere. There should be less droughts, not more. But people are not talking about these things. I talk about them because when I talk with the farmers want to know, what's the precipitation going to do? They can tolerate temperature changes because they do it from year to year. But the precipitation is a much greater issue. And by the way, that's how I got into studying water resources, because after studying climate for a couple of years, I suddenly realized that the most devastating events are droughts for the plants and the animals and for human condition. I mean, you look at the droughts in the 30s, and then the droughts of the 88, 89, where they had to reduce the barge traffic capacity in the Mississippi by 50%, and all of these other things. But they're not even focusing on the precipitation because they don't have the data, but also because they don't want to talk about water or water resources because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, water vapor is by far the largest and most important greenhouse gas, and they simply don't want to look at it. But the precipitation patterns are of much greater concern, and cooling is of greater concern. I teased one group that I was talking to. They were shouting and yelling at me, and I said, well, we're preparing for warming and it's cooling. If the cooling occurs as we're expecting it to do based upon sunspot activity, solar activity, that will be much, much cooler by the year 2015 and 20, and then right down to a cooler by 2035, comparable to what we had in the last little ice age, then the only hope for rapid adaptation, is genetic modification, because plant breeding won't bring you the plants quick enough in the 15 to 17 years it takes to get them online. So you might be forced to use the other thing that you so despise in technological advance. And so all of these issues around the climate debate that are simply ignored, are glossed over, and they can get away with it because, as I say, the public simply don't know about it or don't understand about it, and don't want to show their ignorance.
Dr. Ball, what's become of the hole in the ozone? Sorry.
One of the things I get most frequently after I make a presentation is I had my suspicions, I just didn't know enough to know.
Well, what's become of the hole in the ozone layer?
Well, the hole in the ozone layer was always there. But it's not a hole. It's actually an area of thinning of the ozone. And even at its thinnest, it's still 1/3 the average depth of ozone around the planet. But the phrase ozone layer got out there, And of course, it creates this idea that somehow there's this great big hole, and all this nasty ultraviolet radiation is penetrating down. The ozone hole has increased and decreased with the changing patterns that create it and dissipate it, and it had nothing to do with CFCs. I appeared before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on the Ozone and pointed out to them that ozone is created by ultraviolet radiation, but they started with the assumption that the ultraviolet radiation is constant, in the same way that they say effectively the sun's energy is constant when it isn't. And so if you assume ultraviolet radiation is constant, then you are forced to assume that if you're measuring variation in the ozone, oh, well, it must be something that humans are doing. Because we're always looking for, oh, there's those nasty humans on this planet, you know, we got to get them off the planet. They're doing nothing but harm.
Right.
Again, most people don't know, and we now, by the way, know that ultraviolet radiation varies considerably and explains most of the variation in levels of ozone. And so the ozone hole is another myth. In the same way, by the way, John, that the term greenhouse effect is simply completely inappropriate. The Earth's atmosphere does not work like a greenhouse, but it's become so much a part of our literature and so much a part of the PR and what's out there that the only way you can get around it is to explain to people, just as I've done with you with the so-called ozone hole, to explain to you why the Earth's atmosphere isn't a greenhouse and doesn't a greenhouse effect and doesn't work like a greenhouse at all. But the ozone issue, of course, was one of the early attempts to blame humans for destroying the atmosphere and causing all kinds of problems. And it's interesting that many of the people that were involved or that are now involved in the global warming issue and the IPCC were involved in the CFCs destroying the ozone issue. They cut their teeth on that issue, and they put forward the argument that the Montreal Protocol, it stopped the use of CFCs and it's saving the ozone, didn't make any difference at all. And it was the same thing as with Kyoto. India and China, they said, oh, well, look, you created the CFCs, now you're telling us to have better refrigeration. Now you're telling us we can't have it, and we want to have refrigeration and save some of our food. Now you're telling us we can't have it? How about you lower your levels and let us increase our levels? We said no. They said fine. Then we're not going along with the Montreal Protocol. Now, this is what, by the way, Paul Dreesen has written so well about. It's what he calls eco-imperialism. We take our green and environmental fanaticism and impose it on developing world. And of course, this is one of the most interesting things, because we started a lot of this conversation around the central theme of overpopulation. The world isn't overpopulated by any stretch of the imagination. We produce enough food every year to feed 26 billion people. The weaknesses are we cannot get that food to the table, all of it, or even a reasonable portion of it, and we don't have adequate storage. And the improvement of refrigeration took North America down to 30% of the food not making it to the table or being wasted. In the third world, it's still 60%. And of course, so we deal with the wrong issues all the time. But the other thing that's interesting is, and we've known this since the 1930s, when the economy improves, the population declines. It's called the demographic transition. And it's been happening in the developing world. You look at Japan, you look at France, you look at Canada, the populations are in decline because of the economic conditions. And so the best way to reduce the world population is to allow economic development, but of course they're trying to stop that. And so you've got this irony. Now, in a lot of countries are offsetting the declining population with immigration. The United States is doing it. But Japan isn't allowing immigration, so what's happening? They've got an older and older population with an increasingly smaller, younger population that is not able to support the total social social network, government provision to their old people. And so Japan's either got to allow more immigrants or start facing some realities. Now, that's an interesting part, by the way, John, with China. China dealt with the population issue by restricting families to one child. We worry about China taking over and its economic growth and everything else. And, yeah, that's the case right now. The bigger problem is the Americans have borrowed too much money from them. But China's one child per family is going to have devastating effects on their economy, starting to now. There are not enough girls for the men, and you just distorted the whole pattern so badly that it's going to have huge impact. And so, it's a very, and of course, by the way, it's another example of what happens when you let government run things. It doesn't work.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
people, you can probably hear me clanging around in here, actually. You got me thinking about the water, so I was banging around my stainless steel canteen here. I had a quick question for you, and that is this. When I was in pilot training, in ground school, we had several weather books, and it's my understanding from those teachings that all weather, in fact, it was flatly stated that all weather is due to unequal heating of the Earth's surface. Have you found that to be true?
Yes, that's totally true.
Okay,
and
excellent.
The best manual was, and I used it too, is called Weatherways. That was probably the one you used, and it was pretty universal across air forces in North America. But and this is why, with the IPCC effectively ignoring changes in the sun and the energy coming to the Earth from the sun, for example, what's called Milankovitch effect, changes in the orbit of the Earth, changes in the tilt of the Earth, affecting the amount of solar energy. They don't even include that in their models.
Well, now this sounds like way out conspiracy theory stuff, but I understand that these that those contrails do occur up there in the stratosphere and at very high altitudes. But we see a lot of stuff being sprayed around here. That you see aircraft going by at the same altitudes, but they're not all leaving these trails. And before the end of the day, the entire sky is overcast, and it was not before.
Well, no, but think about it though, John, because you see, the contrail, you can have an aircraft at any altitude is not necessarily going to produce a contrail. It depends upon the temperature and the water vapor content of the air and everything else as to whether a condensation trail is going to be created.
Well, then I've got to ask you this, Doc.
Yeah.
And it's this. If you have two aircraft at the same altitude, one of them produces a contrail and the other one doesn't, what's up with that?
Well, that can happen. The air is so different, from one region to another. And if you want to find that out, even at the surface, and from flying, you watch that temperature and how the outside air temperature changes, and the wind patterns change with altitude. But you just drive a motorcycle out across the air, and you feel how the temperature changes. Within sections of land. So the variability of temperature and moisture conditions and everything else is just quite amazing. And of course, this is why it's laughable that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say, well, you only need one station every 1,200 kilometers to know what's going on with the temperature. Well, that's just crazy.
It sounds like the next thing for you, according to these emails that are coming in here, is people want you to do a documentary, grab an HD camera and make a documentary about this and get this information out to more people, along with your books and your broadcasts.
Yeah, well, there is a very good documentary I did with Martin Durkin out of the Channel 4 in England called The Great Global Warming Swindle. And people might want to look at that. They can download it. If they want to find out how much we knew what corruption was going on in climate science, there was one made in 1991 called the Greenhouse Conspiracy.
What website could they get this at? Where would they go to get this information?
Well, they can get them on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Great Global Warming Swindle, or they can get both of them from a group that I helped set up called Friends of Science. That's all one word, friendsofscience.org, under their video listings. And also another website that I thoroughly recommend, it's the top in the world, is What's Up With That.
Okay.
It's spelled WATTSUP I-S, or what's up? What? WATTSUPWITHTHAT. What's up with that?
What's up with that? Dr. Timball, it's been a real pleasure. You must come back again sometime. It was very, very informative. I'll leave you with this, folks.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Take care, Doctor. What would have happened if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive, or if during the periods of mass arrest, people had not simply sat there in their lairs, paling with terror at every bang on the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood they had nothing left to lose and boldly set up with a half-dozen people and took care of business with whatever else was at hand. That's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Meet me next Saturday at the usual undisclosable location, will you? Until then and beyond, be well. Good night.